Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar on the National Disability Data Asset. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today. Today, I'm joining you from Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland. I want to give thanks for being on the traditional lands of the Kabi Kabi Gubbi Gubbi peoples and acknowledge the connection and care that First Nations people have had with the land, water and life on this country for many thousands of years. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that acknowledgement and respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. So my name is Mel Butcher and I'm the Director of Impact and Engagement at the Social Deck, and we're hosting this session on behalf of the Department of Social Services. Today, leaders from the disability community will explain the purpose of the National Disability Data Asset and benefits for different groups as governments move closer to agreeing on the build of the National Disability Data Asset. We'll also discuss how the disability community are being involved and outline the strong privacy and security protections that will keep information safe. We're very fortunate to have a fantastic lineup of experienced speakers, including Australia's Disability Discrimination Commissioner, Dr. Ben Gauntlet, the CEO of Inclusion Australia, Catherine McAlpine, and Dr. Scott Avery, who's Senior Lecturer at Western Sydney University. Today's guest speakers have a deep knowledge of the National Disability Data Asset, both from their time guiding the project's pilot phase and as leading experts working in disability. Dr. Gauntlet will provide an overview of the National Disability Data Asset and highlight some of the key findings from the pilot. Catherine will cover current data gaps and how the asset could be used to improve outcomes for people with disability. Dr. Avery will discuss intersectionality and the critical importance of protecting privacy. So now I'd like to hand over to Paul Hardcastle, who's the Executive Director of the National Disability Data Asset in the Department of Social Services. And Paul will be providing a high-level update on the project. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Mel. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of which we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who are here today. So, as Mel said, my name is Paul Hardcastle and I'm the Executive Director of the National Disability Data Asset in the Department of Social Services. I'm excited to introduce you to the National Disability Data Asset. As Mel noted, we're getting closer towards a position where governments are agreeing to build this disability data asset. And the Department of Social Services is leading the development of this National Disability Data Asset. Once governments have fully committed to build this asset, it will bring together de-identified data from Australian, state and territory government agencies. When the asset is complete, it will be used to provide a more complete picture of the programs and services used by people with disability. The information will help governments to improve programs and services. The assets will be used to share information about how we can improve opportunities and outcomes for people with disability. The asset will also improve how we report on outcomes for people with disability under Australia's disability strategy. The Department of Social Services is working closely with state and territory governments and the disability community to build the asset. We're working in partnership with the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Disability reform ministers from each state and territory are working together to sign up to an agreement to share data so the asset can be delivered, and it will be one that's a truly national asset to benefit people with disability, researchers and governments. We're working closely with the disability community to ensure they have an ongoing decision-making role in the use of this asset. We've been working closely with disability representative organisations to ensure the project remains aligned with the disability community's expectations. A council made up of community, expert and government representatives is being established to oversee the asset and provide insights to disability reform ministers. In addition to a council, a charter will be in place that will set out what the de-identified National Disability Data Asset can be used for and what it can't be used for. The council will guide the use of the asset according to a charter, and the The Council and the Charter are expected to be in place around December 2023, following final approval by the Disability Reform Ministers' Council. Now, our approach to this project is to do it in partnership with Australians with Disability. With this in mind, we have a short video to play that discusses the potential for the asset to improve the lives of people with disability. This video features Belinda Drew in a former capacity as CEO of Community Services Industry Australia.
I was born premature, which led me to have cerebral palsy, which affects my balance. It also affects my vision.
I'm a C5, C6 incomplete quadriplegic, so I've been in a wheelchair now for just over a decade due to a diving accident.
The main challenge is accessibility into buildings and also having employment options.
I always feel like the clock's against me, changing people's perception.
Australia is very accessible, but it also has a very long way to go.
The National Disability Data Asset seeks to acquire and use de-identified data from people with disability in Australia to ensure they are at the centre of the design of policies, services and programs going forward.
We're pretty lucky here in Australia with a lot of the supports that we've got, like disability support workers, occupational therapists, and all the psychologists and all the different physiotherapists.
I need multiple support services throughout my life to live independently. They are all fragmented at this point, and they are not treating the person from a holistic approach. And so they need a common database to find out how it impacts people with disability.
Currently, data from disability supports, health and wellbeing, and from areas of employment are not linked. The extent to which people's employment contributes to their health and wellbeing, or the extent to which the supports that are provided to people with disabilities and their families facilitate them becoming actively employed in the community, are not available to us. So the picture that we have could be made much more complete if we were able to link those three stories together.
From me looking at it as a service provider also, having that information would be able to propel the services forward, connected, helping that person with disability.
For disability service providers, data is incredibly important feedback. If we could get a better picture, we could design disability supports and other responses to people with disabilities in a way that not only met their needs, but was also directed by their interests and aspirations. We could change the way that the system works because that data would inform service delivery, the way that investment in services happens, the way organisations themselves might make changes, and the way government might make policy into the future.
It's incredibly important that people with disability are placed at the centre of any design process going forward. It could enable them to access services in the community in a manner that is far more seamless than it presently is, and hopefully become a foundation for good policy development for generations.
People like myself are going to keep having accidents, people are going to be born with disabilities. So with the NDDA, let's try and get a service system to surround that throughout the nation.
Disability is not a barrier to anything you want to achieve in life.
The disability community's feedback and participation is critical to the success of the National Disability Data Asset, or NDDA. To stay informed about the progress of the National Disability Data Asset and connect with us, you can visit our website, nddA.gov.au.
Thank you. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Gaultner to give his perspective as the former chair of the Pilots Disability Advisory Council.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm presenting to you from today, being Gadigal land of the Eora Nation in Sydney. I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience today, and also that it is a particularly challenging time for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia at present. I want to today talk to you about 4 things. The first of these is the type of information that will be initially collected in the National Disability Data Asset. The second is who will benefit from the National Disability Data Asset. The third is the insight from the pilot programs that will run within the National Disability Data Asset pilot. And finally, I want to talk to you about the purpose and design of the Charter and Council. The National Disability Data Asset will connect existing de-identified information from government agencies. The first 3 areas the asset will focus on are reporting on outcomes under Australia's Disability Strategy 2021 to 2031, health outcomes for people with disability, employment outcomes for people and employment outcomes for people with disability. In the future, the asset is also expected to include information on such areas as early childhood development, school education, housing, the justice system, and transport. In terms of the initial 3 areas that were focused upon, it is, I think, important to note that Australia's disability strategy is the foundation upon which a number of other disability policies are built. And for that reason, it is an outcome area where we need good data and data development. Health outcomes and employment outcomes for people with disability are also clear areas of concern, given some of the testimony that occurred in the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of people with disabilities, but also when we consider some of the human rights obligations that are imposed on Australia under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The benefit of the National Disability Data Asset is broad. It benefits not only people with disability, their family members, and people who support them, government, researchers, and also organisations that seek to assist people with disability in the community. The obvious way that the National Disability Data Asset benefits these groups is through the provision of accurate and timely information. But data in and of itself is not enough to ensure good services. And what the National Disability Data Asset can do is make invisible need visible by linking previously disparate data sets in a way that ensures that we can assess not only what need exists in the community, but also the outcomes of policy endeavours or potential policy endeavours to seek to ensure that people with disability are given the ability to lead a dignified life. I was delighted to be asked to be chair of the National Disability Data Assets Advisory Council. In terms of the pilot program itself, the project went through 2 years of testing. It was guided by a group of experts on the National Disability Data Asset Advisory Council, who I thank and whose names can be found on the website for the National Disability Data Asset. I know that we have two of those people speaking with us today, but it is also important to note that the Advisory Council also included people with lived experience of disability. And what the pilot sought to do was to have a series of governmental partners provide data to it to enable it to look into specific areas of inquiry. And these specific areas of inquiries included the outcomes for early childhoods, the justice system, education to employment, mental illness, and housing. Australia, the Australian government, the Australian Capital Territory, the New South Wales government, Victoria, South Australia, and Queensland governments all worked together to provide data in the pilot. And what the pilot revealed was that for people with disability, there was both a profound need to look at how services are delivered and outcomes are achieved, but also a need to improve the data that we have in the community to ensure that people with disability are looked after in a way that ensures they are treated with dignity and respect. One of the findings that existed in relation to the pilot programs was in relation to young adults with disability in South Australia who worked full-time. It was found in that particular pilot that they earned 18% less than individuals without disability. This kind of information helps government to improve the pay gap for people with disability. We know that the collection of statistics and data is a key aspect of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Article 31, to be precise, because the linking of data can ensure that we make sure that no individual with disability is left behind. And what the pilot programs did was to show that whilst there is enormous potential within the National Disability Data Asset, within that potential, there is also a need to constantly work at ensuring that we have fit for purpose data to enable appropriate assessment of what is occurring in the community to take place. Finally, in the development of the National Disability Data Asset, the Disability Advisory Council sought to ensure that governance was a key aspect of how the data asset would be created. The data asset is to be co-governed by governments and the disability community. The mechanisms of co-governance will be a council made up of half government representatives and half disability community members, and a charter will outline acceptable and unacceptable uses of the assets. The council itself will be an advisory body that reports directly to disability ministers. And the role of the council is to make sure the asset is used correctly and only for the purposes that align with community expectations. In this regard, a draft charter was developed by the National Disability Data Asset Pilot Disability Advisory Council and provided to disability ministers. The charter contains guidelines for the asset and rules for which the data asset can be used and those for which it cannot. The Australian government is, as a result of this draft charter, consulting with representatives from the disability community to finalise the charter before sending it to the disability ministers for approval. And I think this is a very important aspect of the National Disability Data Asset. We know that the asset itself can make visible what is presently invisible need in the community. But to do so, it is important that there is clear ethical oversight, transparency, careful development, and capacity building to ensure that the National Disability Data Asset benefits people with disability now and in the future. So I might leave it there and thank the Department of Social Services for hosting today's event. I look forward to hearing from Scott and Catherine later about their experiences in relation to the development of the data asset. This is, though, a critical human rights issue for Australia, and one, if carefully developed, can have profound implications for people with disability throughout Australia now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gauntlet. And now is time to ask some questions coming from the audience. We will go back to both Ben and Paul to pick up on some of these questions. I have a couple of questions for Ben and then a couple of questions for Paul. Again, we won't be able to get to all of the questions that have been asked in the time, but we are going to focus on some of the common themes coming through, or where it might be important to provide some more information. So the first question that we wanted to ask, this again is to Dr. Gauntlet. The question comes from the audience, and the question is, what about the economic outcomes and poverty levels or status of people with disability?
That's a critical aspect of Australia's disability strategy and would be picked up within the outcome indicators in relation to that issue. But I think it's also important when we talk about the economic position of people with disability, and all Australians for that matter, that it's not just about the monetary transfer to that individual, it's also about their aspects, their ability to access good housing, their cost of living in terms of things such as power, water, etc., and also their access to health and services of that nature. The benefit of the National Disability Data Asset is that it can hopefully make sure that policies designed to ensure that no one is left behind are better, they're more effective, and the outcomes of those policies can be properly assessed. So although it will take time to build the National Disability Data Asset to ensure that it is fit for purpose, but also has appropriate ethical oversight, it will, in time, enable issues such as economic inclusion and economic participation to be dealt with in a manner which is hopefully better than it would have been without the National Disability Data Asset's existence.
Thanks very much. And I think related to this somewhat in terms of tracking some of those outcomes, we have a question that talks about the fact that it's critical that we have a way of tracking outcomes regarding access to services and supports for people with disability who are not eligible for the NDIS. Is this sort of information going to be captured under the asset? And in particular, how will the asset track outcomes for people with disability who are over the age of 65 who don't meet the requirements, age eligibility requirements for the NDIS?
So the way how the asset works is it takes existing data sets, which are de-identified, and links them. So provided those issues are dealt with in a data set, they can be linked in a way which ensures that people are captured by the data asset in the linkage process. There is undeniably a need for data improvement and capacity building That includes such things as definitions of disability that are used across data assets. It includes also making sure that we are collecting the best data in relation to particular issues. And those issues will be dealt with over time. But at the start, it's important to put in place a structure and process that ensures that people with disability are at the centre of what occurs, that there is ethical oversight, and that we make sure that we have a broad-ranging definition of disability that would also extend to such things as chronic medical conditions and would by no means be isolated just to people who are presently participants on the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Thank you so much. And this question, I think, would be best directed to Paul. And the question is, the data is de-identified, as you've mentioned. Will the data be linked between systems before it's de-identified so that the whole story of a person with disability can be understood?
So a really key thing for this data is that the identifying information won't be going with any kind of content information. So they'll be kept separate. It's a thing governments call the separation principle. So the information that enables people to be identified will go into a system, and then an identified number will come out and be produced, and that will then go in with the content information. So no content information will actually be held with identifiers. Was there another part to the question, Mel? Sorry, I was just focusing on that part.
Yeah, I think it was more in terms of the other part of the question was around whether you can understand those linkages, say, between different systems, the health system and that sort of thing, while still having de-identified data. So can that...
Absolutely. So because we'll have there'll be identifying numbers that will bring the records together, and so then what we'll see is we'll be able to track people's experience throughout different systems. We're able to see what some of the experience is in the NDDA, with social services, with the tax system. What was their experience when they went through education? What kind of employment history do they have? What's happening in relation to health? So there's a whole range of, and then programs and services that governments put in. So there's a whole range of things that we'll be able to see, and we'll be able to use that information to improve programs and services.
Thanks so much, Paul. Another question that's come through, I think for you also, Paul, but we can jump in if needed, Ben. There is no consistently agreed definitions used in Australia. This is the part of the question. So disability as binary identity groups or classes or type. How will that be addressed in terms of the definitions, and the consistency there?
So I will go, and Dr. Gauntlet, feel free to follow me up. But what we're doing is this work is being led by the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare with the disability community. So we've got a working group that is currently working through a way to actually have source data from across the different systems to have a broad definition of disability. We're also working to have, that same group is working to be able to have disaggregate data by disability type in a way that hasn't been done before. And so it's slow, methodical, difficult work, but it's work that is being progressed through those agencies and with the disability community. And so disability representative organisations and disability researchers are involved in that work to have an asset that will be really useful for the broad community.
I think the only thing I'd emphasise on top of what Paul has said, because he has a lot closer oversight of how the asset is presently being developed, is it was always acknowledged throughout the pilot process, and this is why there was a pilot process, that there would be a need for a data improvement policy and process that would exist. That exists also as part of Australia's disability strategy, and understanding that we have to get better in terms of how we assess outcomes. And that's a really important issue from not only an economic and social policy perspective, but also from a human rights perspective for Australia, to ensure that we really do want to have fit for purpose laws in this respect. We know that people with disability are diverse, but disability itself is diverse too. And also that there are a lot of people in Australia who have a chronic medical condition. So 47.3% of Australians live with some form of chronic medical condition. And we need to ensure that when appropriate, the National Disability Data Asset picks up indicators to ensure that policy frameworks are fit for purpose for all Australians now and in the future.
Thank you. Another question that we've had coming through, I think this might be to you, Ben, which is, how can we find out who's been involved in the pilot and the actual data that was collected, other than what was mentioned, for example, or what's been previously mentioned, which government departments, contact points, things like that?
The website for the process, nddda.gov.au, is quite comprehensive in this respect in terms of both reports on the pilots, but also how the pilots were formulated. There was also some community engagement undertaken both with Purple Orange in South Australia, and also with the Sydney Policy Lab. The actual pilot itself was run out of the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet, with DSS being involved from the Commonwealth, and then a series of governments giving their data in relation to particular pilots, which are actually outlined on the website itself. I'm sure if a person has a particularly precise question in relation to how the pilots were undertaken or what's being done with the information, they can follow through in relation to the present National Disability Data Asset decision-making framework to ensure that those issues are answered. But one of the things that I've always found really fantastic about being involved in this project was just how willing people were to both learn but also be engaging with how pilots and processes were undertaken, because I think this is an area where we all agree a lot of good could be done if it's done in a transparent, ethical and capacity building manner.
Thank you. And also the same person has asked us to follow up there around, will the type of data currently collected in the pilot be available for review?
I'm not aware of whether the actual underlying data would be able to be analysed by another person, just because of some of the considerations in terms of how it was acquired, etc. But what I can say going forward is that what we seek to do is to make as much data publicly available so that not only researchers, but also government service organisations, and most importantly, people with disability, can hopefully use that data and those outcomes in a way that enables better policy or better decisions to be made. And one of the things that really came through strongly in relation to the pilot programs was that we need to be careful in how we present that data. Not everyone loves a good spreadsheet. Sometimes people need to look at data in a slightly different way or be informed of outcomes in a different way. And that's an aspect of why the community engagement work was undertaken in the way that it was.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just one last question. The question is, will there be the same kinds of restrictions on the use of this data for regulatory or legal functions as we see on other integrated data sets?
I'll go first, and I'm sure Dr. Gauntlet might have some things to talk about as to what the Disability Advisory Council just talked about in the pilot. But yes, there will be. So there's legislation's being, the legislation we're planning on using in terms of for operating this is the DAT Act and the Data and Transparency Act. And what that does is that places legislative restrictions on how it can be used. It authorises the information to be used for research and analysis purposes, and puts a range of restrictions on things going beyond that. In addition to that, there is the Disability Charter that that ministers will be asked to endorse at the end of the year. That's currently going through a process of being refined, being tested with a range of disability stakeholders based on the really good work that the Advisory Council did last in 2021 in terms of developing it. You might have something to say about that as the chair.
I think safety, legal concerns, ethical oversight, transparency were all absolutely at the forefront of the council in terms of developing the charter. Human rights principles were also incredibly important. And so what we hope is that there will be a series of significant legislative protections put in place for how data is used. And one of the reasons for having no-go zones was in particular to be able to ensure that people with disability are appropriately protected in terms of the collection and use of data. And this, it is important to emphasise, will be a slow process, sorry, slow is not probably the word, a considered process in terms of making sure that fundamental human rights principles are respected. But hopefully what will happen over time is that the long-term outcome on output will be particularly significant for Australia.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for in this section for questions. I do want to note, thank you very much to Dr. Gauntlet and to Paul for answering those off the cuff. I do want to note that there's a number of other questions on there that are very important as well. And as mentioned previously, they will be where we can added to the Q&A section on the NDDA website. So I would like now to hand over to Catherine McAlpine, who's the CEO of Inclusion Australia and part of the National Disability Data Asset Disability Advisory Council. Catherine will give her perspective on why we need a disability data asset, some gaps that the asset might seek to address, and how it might be used. So over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Mel. I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and take the opportunity to thank them for their care of the lands and waters over many generations. I pay my respects to elders past and present and also warmly welcome all First Nations people to the webinar today. And for the people who might not be familiar with the work of Inclusion Australia, we are the national disability representative organisation representing people with an intellectual disability and their families. So when we talk about data, we know well these days that more than 1 in 6 Australians have a disability. What's far less well known is that there are about 460,000 people who have an intellectual disability, and currently we are unable to put a number on how many people with an intellectual disability are students in mainstream schools or have jobs in the open market, let alone how many people with an intellectual disability might be in jail or who have limited access or no access to support for decision making. And even the NDDA, who over the past decade has amassed much more data than we had before, is not able to tell us how many NDIS participants experience both an intellectual disability and autism. These are very specific examples that show how currently governments don't have a complete picture of how people with disability are supported by all the different levels of government and agencies. And these would include Medicare, public hospitals, schools, employment services, housing, obviously the NDIS, and income support. The information about all these services and support is really dispersed, and so governments are not able to understand the needs and outcomes of people with disability. And many of us have been very frustrated by the low level of accountability of various government portfolios and different jurisdictions related to our first National Disability Strategy. We really learned the hard way how data is very separated between government and service systems, and that's very hard to measure outcomes nationally and fix the gaps. And so we need to improve the way that governments and service providers interact and support people with disability. And we also need them to understand that people with disability are a broad group with highly diverse support needs. All of us, individuals, representative organisations, disability providers, NDIS, employment services and more, and governments require better information to make better decisions. And accurate and robust data plays a really important role into policy development, decision-making, identification of gaps and monitoring of progress. Used effectively, data can provide governments with rich insights about how and better outcomes for people with disabilities, families, and their communities. And access to accurate data and statistics about people with disability will support the government in developing better policies and monitoring the outcomes under the current Australia's disability strategy. Australia's disability strategy includes outcomes areas on the issues that people with disability have said needed to improve. And so the data asset will report on these outcomes and help to tell us if the strategy is changing the lives of people with disability. Over the last few years at the Disability Royal Commission on the violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with disabilities, we have heard terrible stories about the violence and abuse that occurs in invisible, segregated settings, as well as in public, as well as about preventable deaths, the criminalisation of intellectual disability and neurological diversity, especially for young First Nations people. And we sincerely hope that the Disability Data Asset will be helpful in addressing the findings and recommendations of the Commission, again, as Ben said, by making invisible need visible through reliable data. In early 2020, which was early in the work of the Disability Royal Commission, Inclusion Australia commissioned a report that collated recent data on people with an intellectual disability. And we wanted that report to focus on prevalence, so just the bare numbers of prevalence, demographics, what sort of government support people received, how many people had restricted decision-making power over their own life, schooling, employment, living situations, and access to technology. And the report highlighted the need to improve the collection and analysis of disability data within Australia. The report stated, the compilation of data for this report highlighted the difficulties in accessing reliable and comparable information about people with intellectual disability in Australia. There is a need for agreement on definitions of intellectual disability to inform consistent data collection at Commonwealth and state and territory levels, to enable comparison and accurate reporting, to inform the provision of relevant supports and services, including advocacy. The proposed National Disability Data Asset should go some way to filling these gaps, but only if data are recorded and reported in ways that are meaningful to researchers, advocacy groups, policymakers and others who seek to use it using consistent definitions to assist with identifying those who have lifelong intellectual disability. So as Ben was saying, what we really see is that without consistent definitions, we're actually unable to find out these things. We found out during the pandemic, for example, once we went to health, that there was a whole lot of assumptions about where people with an intellectual disability lived that were wrong, that really impacted in the rollout of the vaccinations. So these things are really critical for governments to know and understand. And we also saw data accuracy issues even in the NDDA test case on education to employment in South Australia. The data identified only 1,704 students with autism in South Australia, which is not consistent with the data from the NDIA on the number of people in South Australia, young people in South Australia with the diagnosis of autism. So it's vital that the data is accurate and complete, and obviously there is some way to go. And you heard the emphasis just a little earlier on the data improvement work that needs to be done. And obviously for us, we would say very strongly that there's a need for agreement of definitions of key variables, including intellectual disability, to make sure we can compare we can have comparison and accurate reporting. People with disability are diverse in terms of needs, experiences and outcomes. And we want to make sure that grouping people together does not end up with simplistic and inaccurate outcomes that are open to misinterpretation. So Ben used a really good example earlier of understanding that people with disability have incomes that are 18% lower than average. But what that doesn't reveal is that the people with intellectual disability in that data set might be the only ones earning as little as $2.75 in Australian disability enterprises or supported employment, which is way less than 18% below the national rate. So it's really important that we have that overall data and that we also have specific data. When it comes to risk, the data access and sharing comes with risks to individuals and organisations. And these include the risk of confidentiality and privacy breaches, misuse of data for purpose of monitoring or enforcement, robo-debt, misinterpretation of data, which may lead to poor policy and service development for people with a disability. And as the people watching will know very strongly, the disability community is particularly sensitive to these concerns due to their reliance on government services and programs and the long history of stigma and discrimination that people experience. As Ben said, Article 31 of the UNCRPD outlines the responsibility of state parties to collect appropriate information and data to enable them to develop and implement policies and programs. And it notes that this must be done with consideration to appropriate safeguards and ethical principles. In addition to the normal governance and safeguarding that would be in place for any data linkage approach, there are additional considerations related to the use of data related to people with disability, including intellectual disability, which is why the Data Asset Project went through the 2 years of development and testing, and those of us, a range of people served on the National Disability Data Asset Disability Advisory Council. And one of our key recommendations was that there needs to be strong protections in place to ensure that the data asset is not used against the wishes of people with disability. This includes having a charter, which will make sure the disability community knows how their data is being used and are comfortable with how it is being used. And as Ben mentioned, the council developed a draft charter with rules and principles that explain how the data should be managed. And the draft rules ensure that the disability asset will only be used for the purpose of improving outcomes for people with disability. For example, the asset could be used to improve government policy, to evaluate programs that support people with disability, and to understand Australia's progress to meet international disability standards. And the draft rules make it really clear that the asset cannot be used to identify people or to make a decision about an individual's access to government funding. It cannot be used to support automatic decision-making tools when a computerized process helps or replaces a human decision maker. This is very clear and is not the purpose of the asset. And as Paul mentioned, of course, the data will be protected by law under the Privacy Act and the Data Availability and Transparency Act. And so it's really pleasing that the Australian government's working with representatives from the disability community to finalise this charter. And then obviously, once the charter is approved by disability ministers, any changes would need to be tested and agreed by both the disability community and governments.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to go, before we do a Q&A with Catherine as well, we will go to Dr. Scott Avery, who is a senior lecturer at Western Sydney University. Scott will talk about intersectionality in the context of the data asset, as well as ethical considerations and some things to consider around privacy. Thanks, Scott.
Good Yigu, which is hello and welcome in my native language of Gitang. I'm Dr. Scott Avery. I'm a deaf person and from the Warramine. I just want to point out I'm proud of both of those. And I pay respects to the elders and traditional owners of land where I'm on, today the Darug Nation. So when I was invited to talk today, I was given a brief. I said, can you talk about privacy, intersectionality, and some of the outcomes or outputs of the asset, data asset, the data products. And I thought, well, that's an eclectic band of topics if there ever was one. So what I want to do is really bring these topics together around the idea of ethics, put an ethics frame around it. So when I'm talking about privacy, I'm really talking about the ethics of compliance. When I'm talking about intersectionality, I'll be really addressing the ethics of inclusion and the outputs and the products. I really want to talk about the ethical obligations of the data asset for respectful engagement with the disability community. So just on the first point about ethics, and we heard a lot about about privacy today and how their safeguarding mechanisms are built into the Charter to protect the privacy of individuals within the community. So the asset will be collecting de-identified. What that means is your name won't be on it from a range of sources. So the Institute of Health and Welfare, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, various government agencies will be collating, taking away de-identified information and bringing it together to help us understand the lives of our people, our stories, not just in terms of what is happening to us in terms of accessing services, but what we might aspire for in terms of our wanting to grow and get jobs with education, understanding the barriers. So in making these assurances within the Charter that we will safeguard confidentiality and privacy, essentially what the asset is saying here is they're going to comply with the standards that are set under national privacy legislation. And whilst it provides some degree of assurance that these claims are being made, these assertions are being made in public, we still need to make sure that the mechanisms for making sure that takes place are there. And even so, meeting the national standards of privacy and confidentiality, it's a minimum standard and it's not something we should be unduly flattered by when it comes to ethical conduct. So we want to push this idea of ethics forward. So I want to move on to the ethics of inclusion now. And I was asked to talk about intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is referenced in the Australian Disability Strategy, and it's guiding the implementation of the strategy. Now, people are going, oh, what does intersectionality mean? I'm going to talk about it in terms of there are groups within the disability community that have different experiences to other groups. So it is recognising it's more than diversity. It's saying that people within the disability community have different experiences, particularly around discrimination. So I come from the First Nations disability community. In addition to some of the barriers that are disability related, what we might call ableism, First Nations people often experience racism as well. And these things come together and act as a barrier to their inclusion. So an example I have from our community, not far from where I am in Western Sydney, there's an Aboriginal man who I've spoken with, and he has an intellectual disability. And he says, when I go shopping, I get confronted by security guards. And he said, they think he's drinking. He's intoxicated. And this is a case where you have the presentation of disability in public, which is not well understood, coupled with the stereotypes around drinking, Aboriginal people and drinking, create this socially isolating experience for that. Now, that's our community, and other people might experience other forms of discrimination. So gender-based discrimination, women coming up against the patriarchy all the time, transphobia, ageism. There are other things that contribute and conspire to produce a socially isolating experience for that person. Now, the thing is what that does about intersectionality is not breaking down data into tiny bits and understanding what's happening into little parts of the community. What intersectionality means is people are progressively isolated in community if they experience multiple discriminations. And what that means is what is collected by the data, and the data is not always comprehensive of their needs. By definition, they've been disenfranchised from the system, so the system doesn't know about them. And I think the ethics of inclusion is not just about what is in the data, but understanding as who is not as in the data, to make sure that when we're using this data asset to make decisions that affect the lives of the disability community, we really need to push our understanding to make sure who not is just who is in the room, but whose voices are not in the room. And we're making that decision. So the people who are making the decisions need to know the implication of that. And that's where I think the voice of disability is vital in the implementation, because the system will not know, on itself will not know that. So being a part of the First Nations disability community, that's one part of it that helps us understand intersectionality and how people are socially disenfranchised from the systems that are not just provide a service, but to collect data about our lives. The other part is I'm part of a community and the cultural values of our community. And it is grounded on the cultural values. I summarise this as caring, sharing and respect. So an Indigenous culture of inclusion, it sees every person as having inherent for their worth. They're respected for the inherent for their worth. We often say, summarise this as saying, in Aboriginal language, there's no word for disability in Aboriginal language. We're all part of it. We're part of a fabric. And that is something that drives our community and our values, our cultural values. Now, when I look at the disability community and I speak with them, I think the disability community has been patiently waiting for an initiative, a government initiative that sets a high bar in terms of setting and maintaining a respectful engagement with the disability community. And often when I come to events like this or forums like this, it's a case of First Nations are last speakers. So I have a proposition for everyone on the line. Let's upend the agenda. Let's make the cultural values of caring, sharing and respect the cultural values that drive the implementation of this asset. And it sets how we use, how we tell our, not just how we collect the data, but how we tell our stories, that it's around caring, sharing, respect for our whole community. And that's the offering of the Uluru Statement of the Heart, that our culture is a gift to others. So rather than First Nations being last speakers, let caring, sharing, respect be the cultural values that set the ethical framework for this data asset moving forward. So with that, I just want to say Marambu, which is thank you for turning up not just to this forum, but to every disability advocate, champion of human rights that are watching today. Thank you for turning up, not just today, but yesterday and tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Scott. Don't go anywhere, please, Dr. Avery, because I'd like to bring back Catherine as well. And we did just want to ask a few questions from the audience, a couple of questions that we have to you. So one of the things that we wanted to ask to you, Catherine, to start with, was that around your involvement with the Pilot Disability Advisory Council. How important was it to have data experts as well as disability experts sort of working together with representatives from the disability community? What was that sort of like?
Oh, that was critically important, Mel. Of course, I was one of the people who is not a data expert, and so felt, there were some of the discussions that had at a very high level about how linkages happen that I felt was above my pay grade. But what was really important is the people with disability, family members like myself, and people that had policy experience were able to keep bringing up, well, these are the gaps and these are the issues and these are the concerns of the community. And we were able to workshop, how that might be addressed together. So I think that was a critical element of the design. And it happened, I will say, that the process happened around the same time that we were hearing things about robo-debt and things about independent assessments for the NDIS. And so really we were very focused on making sure that we had good guidelines on making sure that the asset was for the benefit of people with disability.
Thanks very much, Catherine. To Scott now for this question. You spoke about ethics, being one of the sort of safeguards for the project. Can you explain a little bit more? Why is a disability-focused approach to ethics important for the National Disability Data Asset?
Yeah, I come from a background where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ethics in terms of research and data, and it comes from a deeper understanding of how data, even with the best intentions, may be misused and mistold. And I think having that experience, we live it. We've lived in our communities. We live through the trauma and the impacts of discrimination. We know we've had that backstory. So when people are coming to, we should not assume ethics. We set an ethic framework around, what's a good time. We should assume that, things can be misused and mistold. And I think mechanisms need to be put in place to make sure not just, this is a benefit, we understand the benefit of it, but how can this be used? We talked about how ethics around privacy can not identify individuals, but we are fully familiar how even de-identified data can be used to stigmatize parts or even the whole of the disability community. So our ethical obligation should reach not just beyond how we collect the data and how we join the data, it should extend beyond. It should be, how do we tell our stories? And that needs to be governed and dictated by the disability community according to their values. And that's why I use the word ethics. Ethics is around decision-making according to a set of values, and only the disability community can bring that.
Thanks so much, Scott. Another question to you. Will the Charter consider the Closing the Gap priority reform to enable shared access to data and information at a regional level for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
I just have to wait a few moments because my captioning is just catching up. It was a question around closing the gap. Sorry, could you just repeat the question again? Sorry.
I can repeat the question, and this comes from the audience. It is, will the Charter consider the Closing the Gap priority reform to enable shared access to data and information at a regional level for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
Look, I think we need to build that. And I think so again, this is how intersectionality plays out in public policy and in the data, is you have closing the gap data systems here. And some of that is advanced, but it hasn't been inclusive of disability. And that needs to be built even within that. But generally speaking, the data is more advanced in terms of what are the socio and economic outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people compared to others who are not. And I think that's where we're at, but we're just starting to build that with the disability data. And what we then need to do is saying, look, there's bits of data here and there's bits of data here over here. And it's a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, because some parts of the puzzle you'll find in this data set and some parts of the puzzle you'll find in another data set. And you have to bring those together. And it's not a statistical exercise. It's people from the community need to know where to look. But I think where we're at in terms of the data systems, that's something we need to go towards and build towards. It's a many-year project. And I think with that kind of project, we have to have a long-term view, but we need a short-term plan to get on with it as well.
Thanks very much. And I think just to another question to you, Scott, there's something that is a little bit related. And if you can answer this, the question was, in thinking about that jigsaw puzzle, will the NDDA collect data on people without a disability for comparison purposes? Is that part of the NDDA?
I think when, I'm not sure where the data is going to come from here, and I really can't speak to how it's all come together in the mechanics. But if you have a look at some of how Closing the Gap reports, it does use data, comparisons between Aboriginal people and other Australians to identify where there's inequality, social inequality. And I think as data systems develop, we don't have a strong statistical base to make that, and it's a reference point. So I would imagine in terms of accountability and identifying where there is inequality between the people with disability and others, we would need to have some mechanism to, whether it's within the data or within the data asset itself, or drawing from other data parts. But I would imagine that if you're looking at, how is there structural discrimination, you need that basis. I suppose to answer the next part of that is we also need to make sure that that is not exclusively a deficit story. And the inequality is one part of it, and we need to highlight and detect that so we can have well thought through programs and responses to overcome that. We need to call out some of the discrimination that goes on in this country, and we need data to do that, because that's the language of government and change. So we need to buy in on that, but it can't just be a deficit story. So we also need to be capturing out what makes us strong, what gives us strength, and what makes us included as well. So it's not exclusively like this deficit story.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's so important. I would like to go back to Catherine now to ask another question, if you can, Catherine. So the question again comes from the audience, and it's what parts of the wording in the charter were hardest to get right in regards to making sure it's only used to improve the life of people living with disability?
Oh, look, I have to confess that I don't have the charter in front of me now, and so I can't say what words are there. But there was a large debate on it. There was large debate and large email discussions between the group to get that right. And I think I'd like to take the opportunity to give my thanks to Scott, because Scott was a really, as you can see, in terms of his leadership in the room, had that combination of expertise that he's worked in disability advocacy and in the First Nation, all on the Closing the Gap and the First Nations work, and he has data expertise. So I certainly looked to him and Ben and others for advice and trust in terms of making those linkages between the desired policy outcomes and the data work itself. In terms of the charter, all I can say is it was great debate, and luckily we had a lot of people who have a lot of experience in the room to help work our way through that. And certainly, as a representative of people with an intellectual disability, we wanted it said in very plain language, very obviously.
Thank you, Catherine. Dr. Avery, would you like to reflect on that question at all from your perspective in terms of what maybe some of what parts of the charter were really important to kind of get right, or might have been difficult?
And certainly the discussions and the time that we were drafting the charter came at the time that there were proposals for an independent assessment around the NDAS. So there was this deep apprehension from the disability community that people had told me about how algorithms and data can come together, and so this was where the disability community was quite strong in making a statement that there needed to be ethics, an ethical framework for this. And it needed to go beyond some of the basic, it couldn't be reduced down to an ethics of compliance. And that's why we spoke around ethics of respectful engagement with the disability community. That's what we're really talking about, ethics, and a culture of ethics. So we wanted to lift it beyond sort of a technical view of ethics, saying, yes, we've ticked the box, said, no, we really need to make sure that the structures for ethical oversight, and it won't just be the people on the committee, on the council here, There needs to be built consultative structures beyond the 3 people. It can't just be left to the 3 people who are represented from the disability community and the others to carry that load. The data asset needs to think about how does it engage beyond and build that in. And to date, I think the development of the data asset has been fueled by the goodwill of the disability community. They've been very generous in giving their time and expertise. We actually need to resource that. And I'm careful to use the word resource it, not fund it. It's not about the dollars. It's about the respectful resourcing of the community organisations, that they're resourced in a way that they can actively contribute to the development of public policy, disability policy. So organisations like Catherine's, Inclusion Australia, that needs to be built in rather than just added onto their workload.
Yeah, thank you. It's really important. I guess just a follow-up question that's also come through in the Q&A from participants is around one of the things you mentioned previously around there not being a word for disability used by First Nations people. And just wondering if there's any strategies, I guess, that need to be adopted to ensure that there is inclusion in the data when there isn't, you know, when there are some of those barriers, for example, in terms of language or identifying someone identifying as having a disability. Was there anything that that you wanted to suggest around that or has been talked about?
I just think when it comes to data, that philosophy, we talk about a medical model, we talk about a social model, and what we're talking about, this no word for disability, this is a cultural model, which is around how do people who've been isolated from community, how do they heal? How do they join and be part of a broader community so they're not personally isolated? Now, data, the medical model tends to dominate what is collected about people with disability because they can get a diagnosis, they can get something that counts. And we have to move beyond that because that's not the only view of the world. There's more data around social barriers to inclusion, so the social model of inclusion. But it's a bit like we're not collecting data on what makes us strong, what makes us feel connected to a community. I said, so it's kind of like a way of thinking or a philosophy, but we need to start provisioning that and looking out for that, because unless we start collecting data and understanding what that looks like, we never get the program. So it's kind of like this cycle. So I think when we think about it, said, sure, we don't want to throw out, you know, the medical model of data around collecting, you know, disability and diagnosis, because that's an important trigger for accessing disability supports. We need to understand better, more around the social circumstances. So we need to push there, but we need to open up our worldview in terms of, well, what actually connects us and heal. And the quality of the data will be different, but this is where we need to think quite strategically about new ways of how we can provide services and supports and programs of inclusion for the disability community.
Thank you so much. Yeah, fantastic answer. And thank you to both of you again for taking questions off the cuff. I will now hand back over to Paul Hardcastle to have some final reflections from everybody and do some wrapping up. So if Paul is there, over to you.
Which is good. So I wanted to just really thank all of our guest speakers, Dr. Gortler, Dr. Scott Avery, Catherine Alpine, for giving your time today to participate and share your insights into this. It's essential that we continue work with the disability community to make this asset one that works for everyone. So thank you for your time on that. What I'd like to do is give each of you a chance for a final reflection. And Dr. Gortler, you're about to go first. So I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and it was great to hear from Scott and Catherine, and I always learn when both of them speak, which is a really important aspect of the disability community how much you can learn from each other. So thank you for that. I think when I think of final reflections about the National Disability Data Asset, it's that good disability policy benefits all Australians, and the National Disability Data Asset, if carefully implemented with sufficient safeguards and an understanding of what ethics is in terms of the use of data, but also the need to capacity build, is an example of good disability policy. However, it is only at a relatively early stage, and we need to be really conscious that we need to take careful steps to ensure that what we have is a policy framework where the benefits clearly outweigh the costs for all Australians, not just for a group such as service providers or government. And when we talk about all Australians, that means each and every Australian with disability must get benefit from the creation of this asset. And I think good disability policy benefits all Australians, but to do so, we need to create trust. We need to be careful to measure outcomes to make invisible need visible. And above all, we need to have a lot of conversations and/or interactions where people with disability are listened to and allowed to give substantive input, which actually can have a material effect on decision-making going forward. And that ability to give substantive feedback that affects decision-making is something which will, in a sense, guide the asset, hopefully for generations, but also ensure that the asset retains the community's trust, which is an incredible, important aspect of all social policy, but particularly a social policy where what can occur is decisions can be made without people always fully understanding or appreciating what are the outcomes that are being assessed. And for that reason, we need to be very conscious of ensuring that the disability community is included at all stages of the process going forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gauntlett. Dr. Avery, I'll go to you next, and then Catherine, I'll be coming to you.
So my concluding thought was my opening thought: caring, sharing, respect. That's the values, that's the culture. Let's go for it without compromise or qualification. That's all I have to say. Nyanyabu, take care.
Thank you, Dr. Avery. Catherine.
Oh, how do I follow that, Scott? I agree with you completely. It's a very excellent framework for us to think about. I just want to reflect on a couple of your earlier words around the challenge of inclusion for all people with disability in the asset. That this is very highly technical work. It's very highly technical. I find myself a person who's quite comfortable with numbers, quite overwhelmed by some of the technicalities of data linkages. And then looking to connect that with culture, looking to connect with the people who are so invisible at the moment, including people who have high support needs but no diagnosis or access to diagnosis as well. And so thinking about how we make that connection, about how we connect this very important work to the community of people with disability, including the people with disability who have been the most marginalised, have had the least voice over over the decades, over forever. And so thinking about things like increasing the data literacy of the representative organisations and of the general disability community so that people really can be in charge of what government knows about them and how that information is used would be a really terrific outcome.
Thank you. So I'm going to, for my reflection, I'm actually going to pick up on a few themes that came out through the questions to just try and provide some information for people. So one of the key things that people wanted was where they could find out more information. So that's at ndda.gov.au. That will include somewhere in the next couple of weeks or so, so mid-May, some fact sheets on the Charter. So you'll see some detail about what the Charter is about, fact sheet on the Council, and on more detail on what the NDDA is. That'll be available in a range of accessible formats. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look at that in terms of that. In terms of comparison, absolutely, this is a data asset that will bring in the data of all Australians so that we can see how people with disability are faring compared to people without disability. It's necessary to measure a range of things in Australia's disability strategy that looks at the difference between those two cohorts, and the National Disability Data Asset will be providing some key information for Australia's disability strategy. We also, if tracking people over the life course, we won't know if people acquire disability throughout their life. So we'll be capturing, we'll be able to see both pre and post for some people in terms of those things. So it's definitely an asset for all Australians in terms of that. In terms of resource, so we have in people's, for our disability representative organisations, we have actually got a specific agreement in relation to the National Disability Data Asset that's done as part of the government's decision to double funding for systemic advocacy in terms of disability representative organisations. So there is that. There's always a question about more resources, but there's at least that. Then there was a question about AI guarantee. So there's kind of two things, and robo-debt, and so there's kind of two things I would give to that. So there's the legal protections, there's the disability community engagement, there's the oversight of the disability community in relation to these things. There's also the practical thing of it being near impossible to actually do because it's de-identified data. And so governments have a range of access to identify data where these things are much easier to do. The NDDA is one where there's de-identified data. So from a practical point of view, this is so it's not an entire impossibility, but it's very, very difficult work to actually re-engineer things back. And there'll be audits and a range of things to make sure that people are using the asset in accordance with what ministers will agree to in the Charter, as well as the Act that we talked about earlier. So I want to thank everyone for your time, for listening in on this. Remind you that ndda.gov.au is where you can get access to that information and also register for getting the newsletter to get regular updates about that. Again, thank you so much for all of our speakers in the social deck. Really appreciate all of your time in contributing to this, and for all of the hours and hours and hours and hours that you put in the pilot to deliver us something that could be, put us in a position where we can actually deliver an asset that will improve the lives of people with disability. So thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.